If you have watched my Doll's House makeover diary right from the start, you will know that my doll's house when I first bought it was absolutely jam-packed with things, including these battery operated lights that were working. So in today's video I'm going to have a go at making some candles that switch on and off using this battery operated light set. Now then, this is very much a tale of perseverance, and if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. Because at first I decided I wanted some little standing chandeliers, some candelabras, and I thought they were taking shape. However, the little battery pack is huge for the doll's house, and hiding it was something that I just wasn't sure how to do. But I was desperate to use these little lights. It felt like they should be in there, seeing as they came with the doll's house in the first place. As you can see, the battery pack is really big. So I took my little chandelier off its stand and then wondered if I could hang it from the ceiling. But to do this, my battery pack would have to hang from the ceiling too. So I had a go at making some discs out of plywood and using these to try and hide the battery pack. At each stage of this, I didn't really have a plan, so I decided to just have a go and see how it turned out. And although this seemed to be taking shape nicely, once again, when I had a really good study of that battery pack, it was just simply too big. So, if you look here, you can see that it's not just the battery pack I'm having to hide, but the spare wires and lights as well. It ended up looking a little bit like a huge birthday cake hanging from the ceiling. So I decided to dismantle the whole thing and start again. I decided to have a rethink. By this point it was getting dark, hence why there is a torch shining on the back of the doll's house room. And I decided to make a sideboard to contain the battery pack so that some candles could stand on top of it. Now I'm aware that in the Tudor period they probably didn't have fitted furniture, but I was conscious that this sideboard was going to jut out into the room where actually I wanted a large chair to sit at the end of my table. So I've decided to make a little alcove into the sideboard just so that that chair has some room when it's at the end of the table, even though it's not made yet. I planned, thinking about how to access the switch of the battery pack and also how to get that battery pack in and out to replace the batteries. And then I started to cut my plywood to make my little sideboard. I'm hoping that I can then pop some candles on the top of here with the lights from the battery operated set poking through. And I'm also hoping that this sideboard can be somewhere where I can put some food that's looking as if it's waiting to be served onto the banqueting table. Now, by this point, it was obviously getting quite late. I'd had quite a few failed attempts already, and now I'd started cutting this sideboard out of the plywood, I actually made a mistake with my measurements. The little holes meant to be there for the switch, but as you can see, some of the wood I've had to patch up. So I decided to leave it there and come back to it in the morning. In the morning, I started by giving everything a really good sand down. Next, I started to think about the finishing details because I was aware that using this plywood wasn't giving a nice, neat and clean finish, especially because of the measuring mistakes that I made. So I used this card, which I actually think might be watercolour paper, but I got it from the scrap store years and years ago. And I folded it to wrap around my little wooden structure so that it covered any bits that were looking a little bit tatty. This was the same card that I used when I made the 4-poster bed, so I'm going to try and do the same that I did with the bed and carve into it or layer on top of it to add some extra detail to this piece of furniture. I cut out a little hole so that I could access the switch to the battery pack without having to take the furniture to bits every time I wanted the candles switching on. I made one of these little cardboard covers for each part of the sideboard, and already it was starting to look neater. I then started to make some 5mm deep little panels to go along this sideboard to add some detail and also to hide a little imperfection at the bottom where I'd slipped whilst cutting one of the pieces of card. I stuck them on with Pritt Stick. In hindsight, I think I should have used PVA glue because some of them have pinged off a little bit since and needed sticking back down. You might notice that as the video progresses. I used some little nail scissors to cut these strips because it helps me to be really precise and make sure that the measurements were really accurate. I decided to add a rectangular panelling style along this left hand side and the right hand side as well. In the centre I decided to do a little shield to match the one on the bed. I started by hand drawing the shield and then I cut it out and popped it on the centre section. This project had turned into something very different from the project that I had initially started, where I was just looking at a single light fitting. So this sideboard is basically there to hide the battery pack, and my plan is to sit some little candles on top of the worktop of this sideboard with the battery pack hidden inside. I was really pleased that my initial ideas hadn't worked, because actually if they had worked, first of all, I wouldn't have ended up with this lovely piece of furniture, and as I was working my way through it, I was becoming happier and happier with it. It also means that I should have some work surface where I can put some of the foods that will be served up onto the banqueting table. So I think it's been a really happy outcome, happy little accidents at the beginning of the video, turning into something really special. I used PVA glue to stick these panels on, making sure that it was covering every single section of the cardboard. I used PVA glue because this is what I'd used whilst making the bed, and it had worked well to make sure that the card didn't crinkle when it was drying. So I think the way that this is working is that obviously it's quite weighty card, and I think it's watercolour paper, and as the PVA glue is quite wet, I think it's relaxing the fibres as it's soaking in, but then it's drying, fixing those fibres in place so that they're stretched across the piece of wood. Of course, PVA glue doesn't dry quickly, so I did have to hold some edges in place until they took hold, and I also used some weighty objects to just try and clip them into place whilst I was waiting for them to dry. Whilst everything was drying, I started to have a little think about my candle holders. So I went into my box of bits and bobs to have a look and see what I could find, and I settled on these beads to use for my candle holders. So I started by chopping the elastic off this bracelet so that I could get the beads. And then I checked the size of the hole to see if these little lights would fit through. I'd also found this button, but unfortunately it didn't have a hole, and I didn't think that I could probably drill a hole into that, so I had to just move on from using that. Now, these holes weren't quite wide enough, but from my previous experiments I was aware that my drill bit on my Dremel was the correct size to allow those lights to get through the hole. So I held the beads in place with some tweezers and then just worked into them with the Dremel. With this bead here, I found that as soon as I kind of touched it with the Dremel, it snapped open in the centre here where the join was, so that was quite lucky because it meant that I could just prise it open. It didn't break the bead, it meant that I could just kind of wrap it back around the wire once I put the wire through it. And then with the smaller beads, they drilled through absolutely fine, so I drilled into each one of them, only making the hole slightly bigger, just big enough so that I could get the wire and the light through them. I then arranged the beads on the worktop to try and work out an arrangement that I would like for my candles. You'll notice there's some beads and buttons that I haven't shown you here. That's because I didn't end up using the wooden ones, but still the arrangement here is important because I wanted to work out where I needed to drill my holes through the worktop. Because of course the cabling and the battery pack will be under the worktop, so I need to be able to push the lights up and through and into the candle holders. Once I'd finished drilling the holes into the worktop, and once everything was dry, I started to give everything a coat of raw umber acrylic paint, trying to make sure that I got into all of the creases and the edges. In some sections it required 2 coats of paint. I also painted the inside and the back and the bottom. I know that you can't see every bit, but it matters to me that it's all finished to a high standard. As you can see, a fairy friend came to help when I tried to put my little candle holders together. So here I am sticking the beads into little arrangements. I'm stringing them onto a spaghetti stick here, so uncooked spaghetti, just because I didn't mind if I got some glue on it. It was something that fits perfectly through the hole, and it just helped to stop the task from being quite so fiddly. Once I had made some arrangements like this, I did pop the spaghetti back through them to just make sure that there was no glue blocking the holes. I decided to make 3 different candle holders. I thought that that would be really nice rather than having 3 that were all the same. I then laid my candle holders over the holes to check that I was happy with the arrangement. And you will notice over the next few minutes of this video that my hands become more and more covered in paint. That's because I was being really impatient at this point. I was excited with how it was all coming together, and I have to admit that the underside of the worktop was not completely dry, meaning that I kept getting paint on my hands. So I slotted my battery pack in, checking that it was still working, of course. And then I needed to slot 3 of these light bulbs through the little holes in the worktop. At first I struggled with this, so then I had to bend the wire over a little bit more so that it was wire going through the hole before the bulb. It helped me to thread it through a bit more easily. As you can see, there's a lot of wire underneath this worktop still, so in a moment you will notice that I coil the wire around in a small loop so that it will fit a little bit more easily into the unit to be hidden away. Although I have loads of little lights on this piece of wire, I have actually only decided to do 3 candles, but there is scope for adding more at a later date if I want to. I can just add some more holes to this worktop. I decided to remove the washer at the bottom of this candlestick holder because I felt that it was a little bit too wide, and I thought it would look better without it. So I just simply removed it and then popped these 2 beads back in place. It was all a little bit fiddly, but it was alright to do. It wasn't too difficult, and I was really enjoying seeing it all come together. The wires had become all tangled together, but I put them into this neat little loop so that they would sit nicely into the unit, and then I popped this worktop back on. So this is what they were looking like, but of course these candles did not want to have coppery coloured wick inside them. So what I did was I painted it with a little bit of black acrylic paint on the thought process that once you've burnt a candle, it starts going the blacky sooty colour. Next it was time to add some wax to my candles. Now if you're following along, obviously be careful because this is just a little tea light, but obviously a candle is fire and it gets hot, so please don't be letting children do this. So what I did was I melted some of the wax and then I blew the candle out. I then used a kebab skewer to scoop up some of the melted wax and gently rub it up and down where my candle wick was, to gently cover it. Now, by this point, the wax was already solidifying. It solidified very quickly. I found that the best technique was actually to work from the bottom upwards, so to drip a little bit of wax onto the bead and then just gradually work my way upwards. This wasn't how I did the first candle, but by the third one, I was starting to develop more of a technique. I kept repeating this technique. Obviously, as the wax was setting in the candle, I kept having to relight it and wait a moment for it to melt again, and I really slowly filled in any gaps. The reason I was waiting for this wax to start solidifying before adding it was because I didn't want to add it when it was too hot, because obviously I'm adding it around the light fittings and I didn't want to damage them. I also added little drips that went down and over the little candle holders so that they looked less like beads and it looked more like a candle that had been melting away. Again, it was a fiddly job, but I really enjoyed doing it and it was worth taking the time over. So this technique wasn't actually the best. The best technique I used was on the third candle, where I popped the wax at the bottom first and then worked my way up. Because as you can see on the middle one and the one on the right hand side, I had to scrape quite a little bit away, okay, which still worked really well, scraping it off, but I had to be careful not to touch the wire because I didn't want to damage it. I've actually realised here that I had my battery pack switched on whilst I was doing this. It would have been much safer to have switched that battery pack off whilst I was working on this, because obviously if I'd have gone through the wire, that would have been not so safe. I also added some wax along the worktop to make it look like those candles had been burning and dripped down. I'm really proud of how these candles have turned out. I couldn't resist popping them into the doll's house to see how they looked. Now it's so dark because it is now night time that I can't actually see how the sideboard looks, so I will come back and show you that in the morning. Just like I did when I made the bed, I added some gold eyeshadow just to bring out some highlights on the detail on this piece of furniture. The top of this piece of furniture isn't attached, and that's deliberate so that I can access the battery pack as and when I need it. So this is how it will stay, but it is just a little bit out of line here. So when I sit it into the doll's house, I'll make sure that it all lines up neatly. Then it was time to add this piece of furniture back into the banqueting hall, being very careful, of course, as I lifted the banqueting table away. Although it was a little bit tricky to get in, it was an absolutely perfect fit. Then it was time to pop the table and the benches back into the banqueting hall, along with some of the plates and the cutlery. this is what everything looked like when it was returned to the doll's house. If you've liked the video, please do leave me a comment and a little like, and do hit subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be hopefully adding more videos every Wednesday, so let me know in the comments if there's anything you think I should make for my doll's house. Thanks again for watching and have a lovely day.